He didn't buy the lodge, it was given to him. A gift from a stranger he saved in a snowstorm. A crumbling lakeside refuge from the 1940s, buried in snow and silence. Thomas Reed, a down-on-his-luck construction engineer, with nothing left but his loyal German shepherd, thought he was only finding shelter from the storm. But hidden behind its rusted doors lay secrets frozen in time, lost wartime letters, a sealed attic, and a truth buried beneath the ice that would change everything. What began as one man's escape from failure became a journey of redemption, love, and divine purpose, proving that sometimes the light we seek waits inside the darkest places. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and may God bless everyone watching. Snow fell in slow, patient silence over the Pennsylvania hills, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. The sky hung low, heavy with unshed tears, and the wind carved through the valley like a cold whisper that carried both memory and regret. Inside a rusted Ford pickup, parked at the edge of an abandoned gas station, sat Thomas Reed, 52, his hands cupped around a dented thermos of coffee, gone lukewarm hours ago. His face, rugged and worn by years of hard labor and harder luck, bore the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much fall apart and had learned not to scream when it did. His brown hair was salted with gray, his beard uneven and flecked with frost, framing a mouth that rarely smiled, but when it did, softened him entirely. His eyes were pale blue, steady, searching, like they once looked at blueprints and saw possibility. Thomas had been a construction engineer, one of the best in his company, until the 2008 crash turned everything into dust and debts. When the company folded, his marriage followed, and what remained of him was a man who rebuilt things for others, but never quite for himself. 5 years since the divorce, he had grown accustomed to silence, except for the sound of paws and the soft breathing of Ranger, the German shepherd lying beside him. Ranger was 8 years old, with a coat of sable brown and black that glimmered even under the dim streetlight. His right ear had a small tear from an old rescue mission, and a faint white streak ran across his muzzle. Once a search and rescue dog, Ranger had been retired after an injury. Thomas found him at a shelter 2 years ago, restless, mistrusting of strangers, but somehow their brokenness fit together. Now they were inseparable, a man and a dog who had both outlived their purpose, trying to find one again. The wind rattled the truck windows. Ranger's head lifted. His golden eyes watched Thomas with quiet concern. "Yeah, I know, buddy," Thomas murmured, rubbing the dog's neck. "Another night, another miracle we can't afford." His tone carried a weary humor that couldn't hide the fatigue beneath it. He reached for the dashboard, glancing at the photo tape there. A smiling young woman, auburn hair caught in sunlight. His ex-wife, Marianne, from a time when life still felt buildable. He pushed the memory away as headlights cut through the storm. A car was crawling along the mountain road, tires slipping on ice. Then, without warning, the rear wheels spun, and the sedan swerved violently before slamming into a snowbank. Thomas cursed under his breath, threw open the truck door, and sprinted through the biting wind. Ranger followed, his paws sinking deep into the snow. Inside the car, an elderly woman was gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. Her silver hair framed a face lined with age but not weakness. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Thomas called, yanking the door open. The woman blinked at him through the fogged glass, startled but lucid. "I think so," she stammered. "The wheels, they just—" "Got it," Thomas said, assessing the situation. He tried to push, but the car wouldn't budge. Ranger barked sharply, circling to the back as if directing him. "Smart dog you got," the woman said faintly. "He's smarter than most people I know," Thomas replied with a half-smile. Together, with Thomas pushing, Ranger barking encouragement, and the woman gently accelerating, the car lurched free. Once it was steady, Thomas escorted her to his truck to warm up. "Thank you, Mr.?" she asked, her voice trembling as she sipped from his thermos. "Reed, Thomas Reed," he said. "And this here's Ranger." The dog sniffed her glove politely, tail thumping. "You're a kind man, Mr. Reed," she said softly. "Not kind," he replied, "just couldn't drive away again." She gave him a long look, the kind that seemed to see more than he said. "I was driving to close a chapter," she murmured. "My family used to own property near the lake. Old place, can't keep it anymore. Too many ghosts, not enough years left to chase them." She rummaged in her coat and handed him a small brass key on a faded blue ribbon. "Take it. There's an old cabin by the water. Need someone with hands that remember how to fix things. Maybe you need it more than I do." Thomas stared at the key, unsure if this was kindness or senility. "Ma'am, I can't—" "You already did," she interrupted with a smile that didn't quite hide her sadness. "Consider it even." She left before he could argue, her car vanishing into the white blur like she'd been swallowed by the storm itself. For a long time, Thomas stood there, key in hand, snow clinging to his beard. "What do you think, boy?" he said at last. Ranger wagged his tail once, as if saying, "We've had worse ideas." So, Thomas drove. Hours later, dawn was breaking pale and weak as he turned down a forgotten road toward the lake. The snow thinned, revealing a sign half buried in ice. Haven Rest Lodge, Est, 1942. What stood before them was less a house and more a memory, a two-story structure with cracked stone steps, boarded windows, and vines gripping its walls like desperate fingers. The roof sagged, the porch creaked, yet the bones of it, the symmetry, the sturdy beams, spoke of a time when things were built to last. Thomas parked, stepped out, and stood still. Ranger trotted ahead, nose to the wind, tail up. Inside, the air was thick with dust and faintly sweet rot. Old wallpaper peeled like faded skin. Furniture slumped beneath white sheets. A faded sign by the reception desk read, "Welcome to Haven Rest. May your stay bring peace." Thomas laughed under his breath. "Peace, huh? Guess we'll see." He set up a small camp in the lobby, spreading his sleeping bag beside the cold hearth. Ranger settled next to him, head on paws, eyes half closed, but alert. As Thomas gazed at the high ceiling, once elegant, now fractured, he felt something shift quietly inside him. Maybe this wasn't just shelter. Maybe it was a test. That night, the wind howled through broken windows, carrying whispers that almost sounded like voices. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked, staring toward the staircase that led to the upper floors. Thomas followed his gaze. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, but Ranger's low growl said otherwise. At dawn, when Thomas stepped outside, he saw something half buried in snow at the base of the porch. A rusted metal plaque, its letters barely visible beneath frost. He knelt, brushed it clean, and frowned. It read, "Dedicated to Captain William Hale, 1904. He didn't know why the name tugged at him, or why Ranger began to whine softly, staring at the frozen lake beyond. Thomas turned the brass key in his palm again. "Well, Captain Hale," he murmured, glancing back at the house that loomed like a question against the winter sky. "I guess you and I are roommates now." But just as he stepped inside, a sharp metallic sound echoed from upstairs, like a door unlocking itself. Ranger froze, ears stiff, gaze locked on the staircase. Thomas's breath clouded the cold air as he whispered, "We're not alone, are we, boy?" The house didn't answer, but somewhere above a floorboard creaked, slow, deliberate, almost human. Morning came thin and gray, with mist crawling across the lake like slow breath. The air smelled of pine, rust, and something faintly charred that Thomas couldn't quite place. He rubbed his temples and stared at the staircase where the noise had come from the night before. Ranger sat at his side, head tilted, eyes fixed upward as if expecting whatever had moved to show itself again. "We imagined it," Thomas muttered, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He tried to focus on the practical, warmth, water, fixing the leaks. That was something his hands could still control. He spent the day cleaning the ground floor. Dust clouds danced like ghosts in sunlight as he swept the cracked tiles, the rhythmic scrape of the broom oddly calming. Ranger followed, sniffing every doorway, every draft, tail stiff when he passed the corridor leading to the attic stairs. That smell again. Burnt wood, faint but real. Thomas pried open a boarded window for air and found himself staring out across the lake, smooth as glass, the far shore vanishing in mist. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of red against the gray. It wasn't until noon that he realized it was a person. A woman stood near the edge of the dock that jutted from the property. She was wrapped in a long burgundy coat, her auburn hair pulled into a loose bun that caught the wind. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone lost in thought rather than place. When she noticed him watching, she lifted a hand in polite greeting, but didn't smile. Thomas hesitated, then walked down to meet her. Ranger trotted ahead, curious but cautious. The woman waited, posture straight but not stiff. Up close, she looked to be in her late 40s, perhaps younger, perhaps just touched by the kind of grief that ages you faster than time does. Her green eyes were sharp, intelligent, but carried a quiet melancholy, like she'd spent years studying the past, because the present offered nothing new to love. "Morning," Thomas said, voice rough from disuse. "Didn't expect neighbors out here." "I wouldn't call myself a neighbor," she replied, with a gentle smile that barely reached her eyes. "More of a trespasser with nostalgia." Her accent was faintly New England, her tone soft but precise. "You must be the one who moved into the lodge." He blinked. "That's one way to put it. You know this place?" She nodded. "I study places like this. I'm Margaret Hale. I work with the County Historical Society, documenting old properties before they collapse into memory." She extended a gloved hand. Her grip was firm, professional, the kind of handshake that once belonged to someone who ran meetings or classrooms. "Thomas Reed," he said. "This is Ranger." The dog sniffed her boots, then wagged once, approval granted. "Beautiful shepherd," she said, bending slightly to meet Ranger's gaze. "He's got that old soul look. Loyal to a fault, I bet." "You'd be right," Thomas said, a flicker of pride breaking through. "Found him after his last handler passed away. Guess we both needed a second chance." Margaret's smile softened. "Second chances," she murmured. "Those are rare things out here." She glanced up at the lodge. This used to be the Haven Rest Lodge, built during the war, owned by a retired Army officer, Captain William Hale. My husband was his great-nephew. She paused as if tasting the words, her gaze drifting to the lake. "He loved this place. He died 3 years ago. I come here sometimes to remember him." Thomas felt a quiet ache stir behind his ribs. "Sorry for your loss." She nodded, accepting the condolence like one receives an old coin, familiar, no longer heavy. "It's part of why I study history. The dead don't disappoint you. They just wait for you to listen." They walked along the dock, boards creaking under their boots. She told him about the lodge's heyday, officers on leave, dances by lantern light, guests who came to escape the noise of the world only to bring their own. And then, one night in 1904, it just closed. No fire, no official reason. The locals say people went missing here, soldiers, a nurse, a few townsfolk. The records end abruptly. Thomas frowned. "You think something happened to them?" "I think something was hidden," she said quietly. "Places remember things, especially ones that were built with secrets." Ranger barked once, breaking the stillness. He stood near the base of the porch, staring up at the attic window. The curtains inside fluttered, though there was no wind. Margaret followed his gaze. "Do you live here alone?" "Just me and him," Thomas replied. "And maybe whatever made that noise last night." She turned to him, eyebrows lifted. "Noise?" He told her about the creak of footsteps, the faint metallic sound. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. "There's a locked attic," he added. "Iron door, smells like smoke. I was planning to open it once I finish patching the roof." Margaret's eyes gleamed with curiosity and something else, something like unease. "Be careful," she said finally. "Old houses have ways of keeping what they're not ready to let go." The sun slipped behind the hills as they returned to the porch. Margaret offered to help catalog whatever he found, old records, photographs, anything that might tell the lodge's story. Thomas agreed, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was her calm presence, the way she seemed to balance warmth with restraint. Maybe he just needed someone who saw him as more than a drifter in a broken place. That evening, after she left, the lodge felt larger, emptier. Thomas lit a fire and sat with Ranger beside it, staring at the dancing flames. He thought about Margaret's eyes when she mentioned her husband, how grief lived there, but also grace. He thought about Captain Hale, whose name was carved on the plaque, and he thought about the door upstairs, sealed with rust and memory. Sleep came fitfully. At some point deep in the night, Ranger began to whine low in his throat. Thomas stirred. "What is it, boy?" The dog was standing, muscles tight, eyes locked on the staircase again. Then came the sound, a thump, faint but deliberate, from above. Another, closer. The boards groaned as if under cautious footsteps. Thomas grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here," he whispered, though Ranger ignored him, moving in front with protective instinct. They climbed the stairs slowly, the air growing colder. When they reached the attic landing, the smell hit him. Smoke and old wood, sharp and acrid, like the aftermath of a long-ago fire. The iron door loomed ahead, chains rusted, lock corroded. Thomas raised the light. For a heartbeat, He thought he saw movement behind the gap at the door's base. A shadow, shifting, then still. Ranger growled softly, tail stiff, teeth bared. "Easy, boy," Thomas breathed, though his own pulse raced. He knelt, reached toward the chain, and froze. The metal was warm. He jerked back, flashlight trembling in his hand. "That's not possible," he whispered. Ranger barked once, loud and sharp, echoing down the empty halls. And from the other side of the door, something, or someone, knocked twice. The morning after the knocking, Thomas woke with the heavy certainty that ignoring the attic was no longer an option. The wind outside had stilled, and a strange stillness pressed against the walls of the old lodge. Ranger sat alert beside him, ears pricked, gaze locked on the staircase as though the dog had been waiting for Thomas to decide. "All right, boy," Thomas muttered, slipping into his boots. "Let's see what's been keeping you up at night." The climb felt different this time. The air grew cooler with each step, and the smell of smoke thickened until it stung the back of his throat. He stopped before the iron door, the same one that had felt impossibly warm the night before. Now it was cold again, lifeless. The chain hung loose, rust flaking at the touch. He gripped the bolt cutters, their weight cold in his hands, and set to work. Metal shrieked in protest, echoing down the narrow hallway like a warning. Ranger whined softly, pacing. When the last link gave way, Thomas hesitated, his breath visible in the dim light. "Whatever's in there, we're doing this together," he said, and pushed the door open. Dust billowed outward, catching the light from his flashlight like tiny motes of memory. The room beyond looked untouched by decades. A large oak desk dominated the center, its surface buried under yellowed papers and an overturned inkwell, long dried to black crust. Maps covered one wall, maps of Europe, red lines crisscrossing battlefronts, notes scrawled in faded pencil. A narrow bed sat neatly made beneath the window, the blanket thin and gray with age. The air smelled of cedar, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like old perfume. Thomas stepped inside, feeling the floorboards creak beneath his boots. Ranger followed close, nose twitching, tail low. On the desk lay a small wooden box, its brass latch tarnished but intact. He lifted it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. There was a keyhole, but no key in sight. "Figures," he muttered. He was reaching for his tool bag when a voice drifted from the doorway. "You found it." Margaret stood there, her face pale, eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. She wore a navy wool coat and carried a canvas satchel filled with notebooks. Her hair was loose today, falling in waves that caught the light from the window. "I heard the noise when you broke the lock," she said softly. "I thought you might need help or company." Thomas smiled faintly. "I've had worse company." He gestured her in. "You ever seen this room before?" She shook her head slowly. "No one has. My husband used to say the upper floor was sealed after the war, that his great-uncle, Captain William Hale, ordered it himself. Any idea why?" Margaret moved closer to the desk, tracing the outline of a map with her gloved fingers. "Rumors. People said there was an accident here, maybe a fire. Others claimed he was hiding someone." She stopped when her hand brushed against a photograph half buried under papers. Gently, she lifted it free. The picture showed a man and a woman standing before the lodge, smiling shyly at the camera. The man was in uniform, U.S. Army, judging by the insignia, and the woman wore a nurse's coat with a red cross on her sleeve. "They look happy," Margaret whispered. Thomas nodded, until they didn't. He pried the latch open with a screwdriver, and the wooden box gave a soft groan. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with a strip of linen gone yellow with age. Thomas untied the knot and unfolded one carefully. The handwriting was elegant, slanted. The ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Lottie, the snow here is nothing like home. It falls heavy, silent, like the weight of all we've lost. I dream of the day I can bring you to America, where no one will call us enemies." Margaret's breath caught. "Lottie, that's German." Thomas flipped to another letter. This one was written in German script, neat and graceful, then translated beneath it in English. They read together in silence, letters between a U.S. soldier named Private Daniel Mercer and a German nurse, Charlotte Weiss. The letters spoke of love born in chaos, of stolen hours behind field hospitals, of plans to escape together once the war ended. But the last letter, dated February 1945, was different. "If something happens, the chest must remain sealed. Tell no one. Promise me you will keep it safe until someone worthy finds it." There was no signature, only a smudge, as if the ink had been blurred by a tear. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. They disappeared in 1945, the same year the lodge closed. Thomas reached into the box again and found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a tarnished military medal, a silver star, and beneath it, a folded slip of paper. He opened it to reveal a rough sketch of the lodge's floor plan, with one area near the shoreline marked by an X. Ranger suddenly began barking, nose pressed to the floorboards. He pawed at a corner of the rug, whining. Thomas knelt and peeled it back, revealing a loose plank. Beneath it lay a narrow crawl space, the air cold and metallic. "You've got a better nose than me, pal," Thomas murmured. Margaret held the flashlight as Thomas crawled inside. The passage was short, ending in a hatch covered with dirt and old debris. When he pushed it open, he emerged outside, behind the lodge, near the lake. The entrance was almost invisible from above, hidden beneath moss and bramble. Ranger squeezed through after him, tail wagging proudly. Margaret followed, brushing cobwebs from her coat. By the water's edge, they found what the map had promised, a small mound of disturbed earth, half frozen. Using a shovel from the shed, Thomas dug until the metal struck metal, a rusted steel box sealed with bolts. Together, they dragged it onto the dock and pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents stamped with military insignia, a few gold coins bearing foreign markings, and a ledger listing coded shipments. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "These are transport logs, war supplies, money movements. These could prove someone was smuggling assets through this property." "Captain Hale?" Thomas asked. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe Mercer used him to hide something." The setting sun bled orange across the lake as they sat on the dock, the box between them. Margaret looked out over the water, her expression distant. "Do you ever feel like some stories find us, whether we want them or not?" Thomas gave a short laugh. "Yeah, but this one feels like it's been waiting." Ranger rested his head on Thomas's knee, eyes half closed, as if content now that the secret had been unearthed. But just as peace began to settle, Thomas noticed something inside the box, a folded photograph tucked beneath the documents. He lifted it out, and his breath caught. It was the same couple again, Daniel and Charlotte, but this time, behind them, in the window of the lodge, was a faint figure of another man watching. His face was blurred, but one detail stood out clearly, the insignia on his uniform, Captain William Hale. Margaret leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. He died 2 years before this photo could have been taken." The wind rippled across the lake, scattering the reflection of the setting sun. Ranger's ears perked again, gaze fixed on the lodge. A soft sound drifted through the cold air. 3 distinct knocks, distant but unmistakable, from somewhere deep inside the house they'd just left. The winter sun rose dimly over the frozen lake, painting the world in shades of silver and sorrow. The surface of the water had turned to ice overnight, a glassy mirror that reflected the skeletal trees and the crumbling lodge that now seemed less haunted by ghosts than by memories that refused to stay buried. Thomas stood by the dock, coffee steaming in his gloved hands, watching Ranger limp slightly on the snow-covered boards. The dog had cut his paw the day before while digging near the shoreline. Even injured, Ranger carried himself with quiet pride, ears sharp, eyes steady, always watching for something Thomas could not see. Inside the lodge, Margaret was poring over the documents they had found. She had changed her usual wool coat for a thick cream-colored sweater and a pair of round spectacles that softened her features. Her red hair caught the light from the window, giving her an almost ethereal glow. "These ledgers are incomplete," she said, tapping a page. "Half the shipments have been erased, and the rest don't make sense. Whoever handled this was trying to cover their tracks." Thomas joined her, his brow furrowed. So, Hale wasn't just hiding lovers, he was hiding money. "Or something worse," Margaret murmured. She hesitated, then looked up at him. "Thomas, if these papers ever reach the wrong hands, someone might come looking for them." As if on cue, Ranger's ears perked, and he let out a low growl. A shadow moved beyond the frosted window. Thomas turned sharply, heart thudding. The crunch of boots on snow echoed outside. He opened the door just as a man approached from the tree line. The stranger was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark overcoat that looked too fine for the wilderness. His face was angular, weathered but not from honest labor, more like from worry and wealth. His hair was slicked back, peppered gray at the temples, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the lodge like a predator assessing a den. "Good morning," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a practiced calm. "You must be Mr. Reed." Thomas stiffened. "That depends on who's asking." The man smiled without warmth. Name's Richard Hale. My grandfather's brother used to own this place. Captain William Hale. You may have heard of him. Margaret froze behind Thomas, recognition flashing in her eyes. You're related to the captain? Richard nodded slightly. Distantly, yes. I've been tracing family assets that went missing during the war. Imagine my surprise when I learned someone had moved into the old lodge. Thomas folded his arms. It wasn't exactly occupied. Nevertheless, Richard said, stepping closer, what's on this land is still family property. I'd like to take a look around. Ranger growled, moving between them. The stranger's expression flickered. Irritation, or maybe calculation. You keep your dog close, Mr. Reed. Some animals don't know who's friend or foe. Thomas met his gaze evenly. He's never had trouble figuring that out. Richard's smile faltered, but he backed off, pretending good manners. I'll be in town a few days. Perhaps we can talk about ownership once you've had time to think things over. He handed Thomas a card embossed with gold lettering before turning back toward the trees. His car, a black sedan with tinted windows, was parked farther up the road. When it disappeared, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. That night, the wind picked up again, howling through the cracks in the lodge's old bones. Thomas couldn't sleep. Neither could Ranger, who paced by the window, occasionally staring toward the tree line. Margaret had gone home before dark, but promised to return in the morning with a contact from the Historical Society who might help verify the documents. Around midnight, Ranger began barking furiously. Thomas shot upright. The sound of glass shattering cut through the storm. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed downstairs. The back window was broken, snow gusting in. "Stay back!" he shouted, but Ranger had already charged forward, teeth bared. The intruder moved fast, a figure dressed in black, face hidden beneath a ski mask. He slammed into Thomas, sending him sprawling, and bolted toward the staircase. Ranger lunged, catching the man's arm in his jaws. The stranger cried out, striking the dog hard with a crowbar. The sound made Thomas's blood run cold. He grabbed the nearest object, a broken chair leg, and swung it with all his strength. The man stumbled, crashing against the banister. For a brief second, the mask slipped. It was Richard Hale. "Damn fool," Thomas spat. "You couldn't just ask." Richard's eyes blazed. "You have no idea what's hidden here." He kicked free, sprinting up the stairs. Thomas followed, heart pounding. The intruder turned toward the attic door, the same one that had once sealed itself against time. He was trying to pry open the floorboards beneath the desk. "Stop!" Thomas yelled. Ranger, limping but determined, charged forward again. The fight was brutal and fast. The crowbar came down, and Thomas ducked, slamming his shoulder into Richard's chest. They both went down hard. The wood splintered under them, revealing a hollow space below. From the darkness rose the smell of dust and iron, and something faintly sweet, like burnt wood. Inside the hidden compartment was a small iron safe, half buried in frost. The air around it was unnaturally cold. Richard froze, eyes wide. "It's real," he whispered, reaching toward it. Thomas grabbed his arm. "You're not touching it." They struggled, slipping on the icy floor. Ranger lunged again, teeth sinking into Richard's sleeve. The man screamed, the crowbar flying from his hand. It clattered against the safe, and the old lock snapped open. Inside, instead of gold or treasure, was a simple wooden box, its lid carved with the initials WH. Richard blinked in disbelief. "That's it? After all this?" Thomas lifted the box gently. It was light, too light. He opened it. Inside was a small urn, a folded letter, and a dried white flower. He unfolded the letter carefully, the ink faded but legible. "To whoever finds this, I, William Hale, confess my sins. The war took what honor I had left. I sheltered Charlotte Weiss from those who hunted her. Daniel Mercer gave his life to save us both, but I could not save her from the fever that came after. She died here, and I could not bear to leave her to the cold. I built this place to keep her close, not to keep gold. The coins I hid were to repay the families of the fallen, not to enrich mine. Forgive me, for I buried love beneath ice and silence." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Richard's face twisted between anger and shame. "A lie," he muttered. "It has to be." Thomas closed the lid. "It's not treasure you're standing on, Hale. It's regret." But Richard wasn't listening. He swung the crowbar again, wild with fury. Thomas ducked too slow. The metal grazed his shoulder, Before Richard could strike again, Ranger lunged, slamming into him. The man fell backward, crashing through the weakened boards and landing hard. By the time Thomas reached him, he was groaning, the fight gone. The sound of sirens cut through the night. Margaret appeared moments later with 2 officers from the nearby town. Her face went pale when she saw the blood on Ranger's fur. "Oh my God! Thomas, is he—" "He'll live," Thomas said, kneeling beside the dog, his hands shaking as he pressed a cloth against the wound. "He's tougher than me." One officer, a young man with freckled skin and tired eyes named Deputy Colin Brooks, took Richard into custody without resistance. Brooks was polite, efficient, the kind of small-town cop who had seen too many domestic disputes and not enough gratitude. "We'll get him to the station," he said, glancing at the damage. "And I'll call a vet for the dog. He deserves a medal." Later, as dawn broke over the lake, Margaret sat with Thomas by the hearth. Ranger lay beside them, patched and resting. Thomas looked at the urn on the mantel, lit softly by the morning glow. "You ever think about what we bury just to keep living?" he asked quietly. Margaret reached for his hand. "Sometimes the things we bury are the only parts of us that were ever real." Thomas squeezed her fingers gently. "Then maybe it's time to stop burying." Ranger stirred, tail twitching faintly. Outside, the ice on the lake began to crack under the new sun, releasing the faint sound of water moving again. Spring came to the lake quietly, like a guest who knocked before entering. The ice that had once sealed the world in silence melted away in slow silver threads, feeding the earth with the promise of renewal. The old lodge, once haven rest, then a prison of secrets, stood reborn under the name the Lakehouse Haven. Its weathered bones had been repaired, its walls painted in soft cream and oak, and the scent of pine and fresh varnish replaced the long memory of smoke. For the first time in decades, laughter filled its halls again. Thomas Reed stood on the porch, watching the morning unfold. His shoulders, once weighed down by years of failure and grief, seemed lighter now. The faint scar on his temple from that night with Richard Hale was barely visible under the early sun. He wore his usual flannel shirt and worn jeans, but there was something new about him, an ease in the way he breathed, a calmness in his gaze. Ranger trotted beside him, healed and proud, his coat shining with health. The old German shepherd had become a local celebrity, known to the town's veterans and travelers as the guardian of the haven. Every morning, Ranger joined the veterans on their walks around the lake. Among them was Earl Donovan, 72, a retired Navy medic with a wiry frame and a limp from an old shrapnel injury. His skin was tanned like old leather, his eyes bright with mischief. Earl wore his veteran cap with more pride than his medals. "You ask me, that dog's got better discipline than half the recruits I trained," he said once, patting Ranger's head. "And more sense, too." Ranger responded by sitting upright, chest puffed, earning a laugh from everyone nearby. Inside, the lodge had become a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go, men and women who carried the invisible wounds of time. Marjorie Whitaker, a widow in her late 60s, with silver curls and a face lined with kindness, managed the kitchen. She had a habit of humming old swing songs as she cooked, her voice trembling but tender. "Coffee's always better when someone needs it," she'd say, filling Thomas's mug before he could protest. Margaret Hale was everywhere, organizing, planning, restoring the attic room into something that honored both memory and grace. Her auburn hair was shorter now, curling slightly at her neck. She moved with purpose, her presence both commanding and gentle. The local paper had called her the historian who brought life back to the dead lodge. But Thomas knew it wasn't just history she was preserving. It was the heart of the place. One afternoon, she found Thomas repainting a windowsill. "You never stop working, do you?" she said, handing him a glass of lemonade. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "When you've spent years building for everyone but yourself, it's hard to stop once you start again." Margaret leaned against the wall, watching him. "You built this place from ruin, Thomas. Not just the wood and stone, the people too." He paused, setting the brush down. "I just gave them a roof. They brought the warmth." Her eyes softened. "You've changed," she said quietly. "The man I met months ago would have laughed at the idea of hope." He looked out the window, where Ranger was chasing a butterfly near the dock. "Maybe I just needed someone to remind me it still exists." Their hands brushed, a fleeting touch that carried more truth than words could. As the days grew longer, the attic room was completed. What had once been sealed in guilt and silence now shone with light from new windows. Margaret arranged the letters of Daniel Mercer and Charlotte Weiss in glass cases, each accompanied by translations and photographs. The final letter, William Hale's confession, was framed near the entrance, a reminder that even those who fall deepest into darkness can still reach for redemption. On the morning of the opening, the lodge buzzed with life. Veterans in uniform stood beside children, townsfolk brought flowers, and the mayor, a cheerful man named Henry Watkins, rotund with thinning hair and an eternally rosy face, gave a brief speech about remembrance and renewal. "This place," he declared, "is proof that the past can be a foundation, not a burden." When he stepped aside, Thomas took the podium, his voice steady but humble. "I came here a broken man, looking for a place to hide, but what I found instead was a reason to build again. Every nail, every repaired beam is a piece of that redemption. This house was born from loss, but today it stands for hope." Applause filled the hall. Margaret watched him with quiet pride, her eyes shining. Ranger barked once, as if echoing the applause, and everyone laughed. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the golden light of sunset bathed the lake, Thomas and Margaret walked down to the dock. The water glowed amber, rippling gently under the breeze. Ranger lay at their feet, content and half asleep. Margaret looked toward the horizon. "You ever think Daniel and Charlotte are still here?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe not here exactly, but I think love like theirs doesn't die. It just finds a new place to live." She turned to him, eyes reflecting the last light of day. "And what about you? Have you found your place?" He looked at her then, the woman who had walked into his solitude and turned it into something whole. "Yeah," he said softly, "right here." She reached out, and this time when their hands met, neither pulled away. The lake shimmered beneath them, and the sound of laughter from the lodge drifted across the water. The lights inside flickered to life, one by one, until the entire building glowed like a beacon against the fading dusk. Ranger stirred, lifting his head, tail thumping softly against the wooden planks. Thomas knelt, scratching behind his ears. "We made it, didn't we, boy?" The dog's eyes, warm, wise, and loyal, seemed to say what words could not. Thomas straightened, taking in the sight of the lodge, the people, and the woman beside him. His voice, low and thoughtful, carried across the quiet air. "I came here to escape the past, but instead, I found what was missing. A home, a heart, and a friend who never gave up on me. Maybe light never disappears. It just waits for someone brave enough to walk through the dark to find it again." And as the last of the sun sank beyond the trees, the golden reflection on the lake seemed to linger longer than it should have, like the light itself was listening. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the wag of a loyal dog's tail, in the kindness of a stranger, in the courage to forgive what once broke you. Thomas and Ranger didn't find gold in that house by the lake. They found grace, the kind only God can place in the hearts of those who keep faith when the world turns cold. Maybe you've walked through your own winter too. Maybe you've waited for something to change, not realizing that the miracle was already walking beside you all along. So tonight, may you find peace in the small things, hope in the quiet moments, and light in the love that never leaves. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that God still works through ordinary people and faithful dogs. Leave a prayer in the comments for those still searching for their miracle. And if you believe that goodness always finds a way back home, don't forget to subscribe. And may God bless you and your loved ones tonight.